There we go. So let me start with what I take to be the sliver of good news in the most recent election in the United States, and that is that it went off peacefully without any real credible problems in the electoral system. We are still counting votes in several states. We don't know all the outcomes, but that's actually just politics as usual. And I will note that one of the things that's interesting here is that as soon as it started to become clear that Donald Trump was winning and was winning a clear victory, almost all of the noise about election interference, about immigrants voting, about voting fraud, about voting machines being hacked,
Oh,
right? The joke you're hearing is that the Democrats forgot to cheat this time, right? And so yes, we can get a little bit of gallows humor out of all of this, and so the idea that maybe in some sense this puts to bed the ongoing allegation coming from Donald Trump that the election system is not to be trusted. Of course, it's a one-way street, only not to be trusted when he loses. But having said that, in some sense, I hope for the majority of the American people, this vindicates the fact that we can have fair, open, honest elections. There were a few people on the left saying that Joe Biden should use the Department of Homeland Security to investigate how this happened, but that stuff didn't go anywhere. And so I think maybe one of the things that happens is exemplifying what a peaceful transition of power looks like and why we value it as well. Having said all of that, I also want to note that we elected the people of the United States in a clear cut popular vote majority. I think it is the first time a Republican in the 21st century has won an outright majority of the popular vote, only the second time that the winner of the popular vote is a Republican, and that it is also a clear-cut electoral college victory, where not every state has been called, although I should have updated my map. I believe Nevada has now also been called for Donald Trump. But having said that, let me also note, just at the outset in kind of taking stock of what happened, that in this election, a woman of color won roughly 70 million votes, one that is to say about 48% of the vote. This is a 3 percentage victory in the popular vote. It is a clear, but I don't want to say decisive or landslide victory. And so for the people who thought that a woman of color could never command popular support, well, there's an element of truth in that, but I do think that the idea that Kamala Harris won 70 million votes is also something that we should note as a growing sign of the viability of people who are not simply white men to be president of the United States. I will add very quickly that David Pearson is saying that Bush got the popular vote in 2024. I'm sorry, in 2004. Yes, he did, but he didn't get an outright majority. That's the distinction. But anyway, so second time this century that a Republican has won the popular vote. First time that they've won an outright majority. Sorry, that's not particularly significant, right? The thing that I wanted to note also is that it appears now that Trump has won 6 out of 7 of the swing states and may, in fact, also win Arizona. But it also appears that Democrats have won the majority of Senate races in the swing states, and that Democratic women have won at least 3 of those races, that we will have 2 black women in the Senate. And so I want to be as clear as possible. Not a total and decisive victory for Donald Trump, but a clear cut victory. And I want to say a knowing, right? The Donald Trump as a known quantity, unlike in 2016. And I think in order to discern the deeper significance, to make sense of this, we have to acknowledge that the majority of the American people recognize that Donald Trump tried to hold on to power in 2020, that Donald Trump is a convicted felon, that Donald Trump is someone who's a fabulist or a liar, right? A bullshitter, to use it in the technical philosophical sense, indifferent to the truth of what he says, that he ran a misogynist campaign. And all of these things did not disqualify him or did not diminish his appeal, or at least not sufficiently to prevent him from winning support from the majority of Americans. And so we've got to get clear about what the nature of that appeal was. And I started this year in January. The first thing we talked about was the economy. And I ended this election cycle by speaking with you about whether or not, right, the success of Biden's economy. Did I just lose the slides? Are you still seeing them? No. Let me get the slides back. Sorry. The success of Biden's economy might cost Biden and his successor the election. I do think what happened in this election fundamentally is that of the two candidates, the candidate who best articulated the sense of economic decline, precariousness, and frustration of the American people was Donald Trump. And that may be frustrating to many of us, right? How can the oligarch, the plutocrat, the billionaire who did nothing in his first term to help ordinary people but only helped his rich pals have won on the basis of economic discontent with the level of inequality and precariousness in our society? He did, right? And so in some sense, the Democrats failed. Trump succeeded in meeting that mood, in giving articulation to that grievance, in convincing people that he would be the better response to it than Kamala Harris. And I think that is a fundamental fact that we have to reckon with, and as we begin to think through what it means for the United States for the next 4 years. I don't anticipate that I will be able to say everything I want to say to you today, or that we will be able to discuss everything we need to discuss about what just happened in an hour today. So I will start, but I will also indicate to you I've got a lot of material to think through, and so this is a conversation that we will continue. To start with, I guess I should have said a little bit at the outset about the Democrats and in particular Kamala Harris and her campaign. And that is because, of course, every presidential race is not just a verdict on the winner, but a comparative verdict on the winner in relationship to the loser. And in this case, I do think the disarray in the Democratic Party is not just about Joe Biden having held on longer than he should have, so long that a primary was no longer possible, and that therefore the Democrats did not get the limited input and feedback that a primary provides. I want to go back to a second for 2016, and I want to say, in a sense, this is the second time that Donald Trump is becoming president, in part because the Democrats failed to select a candidate who was adequately contrastive in the right way, right? And so the Democrats failed as much as Donald Trump succeeded. That might be putting it too strongly, but I start with, for a moment, Hillary Clinton and the fact that we now know that Joe Biden actually did want to run in 2016, and that Barack Obama and the Clintons and the Democratic elite, including in the donor class, convinced Joe Biden not to run in 2016, right? And the result was that Hillary Clinton entered the primaries with a near stranglehold on the donor class. Remember that Bernie Sanders actually mounted a strong challenge to Hillary Clinton from the populist left without the donor class behind him, without the Democratic Party behind him. He's not actually, right, a member of that party. And that should have been a signal to the Democrats that the person that you have pre-selected, right? The literature I read talks about two primaries, the donor primary and the popular primary, and it's only if you win in the donor primary that you get to stand in the popular primary. That the Democratic Party pre-selected a candidate that was not going to compete well with Donald Trump. And Hillary Clinton did win the majority of the popular vote, but Donald Trump won the presidency. And now we are firmly in what I think historians will call the era of Donald Trump. Because he won in 2016, he has become the dominant figure in American politics of the last decade. Now it'll be over a decade, right? And it is moving our politics. Let me now get into this a little bit, but just note that Biden's staying in when 75% of the American people said they didn't want him to stand for a second term because they thought he was too old, but also because they disliked his policies. I think that that's unfair. I think that was premature, but I think, frankly, a political party's function is in part to select viable candidates. The Democratic Party failed to do that in 2016, failed to do that in 2024. We have seen the consequences, right? And having said that, one of the things I think we're going to have to reckon with, and I think Bernie Sanders put this in the sharpest possible language just this week. Note that Bernie Sanders campaigned aggressively for Kamala Harris. But when all was said and done, he also declared that the Democratic Party has abandoned the American working class, and the American working class just abandoned the Democratic Party. It's an exaggeration, but it captures with clarity the fundamental problem the Democratic Party is having in the era of Trump. Trump is pulling the less well-educated and the less affluent voter. Those two things very much coincide in the 21st century in the direction of the Republican Party. And the Democratic Party has not figured out how to respond, how to regain its mantle, the one that it earned in the New Deal and Great Society eras, as the natural constituency of the working class. I think that, in a sense, the Democratic Party has been slow to realize how much of its traditional support has left it. I hope that maps like this will begin to illuminate this for the Democrats, right? Which is to say that almost every county that we have data on shifted in the direction of Donald Trump in this presidential election. This map shows you counties that have 95% or more of their vote tallied, so the West Coast is still not in that terrain yet, in part because they're more liberal with counting absentee or mailed-in ballots. But having said that, as you can see, this was pretty decisive, and I suspect we will see the same thing once California, Nevada, Arizona, Oregon, Washington come in. And I think what we should notice is that this occurred in practically every demographic group. And so this is the New York Times data. I like the way they've done this, which is to say they've looked at counties, not at exit polls. And exit polls are probably the worst of that blunt instrument because there's no random selection, there's no tuning them. You just see who will answer your questionnaire at the polling place. They're highly imperfect instruments. So this alternative, right, looking at what the counties have done, you can compare counties that have a higher concentration of people with high school degrees or less with counties that have a strong concentration of people with college degrees. And what we see is that the less well-educated counties moved a little bit more in the direction of Trump, but not a lot more. That majority Hispanic counties move strongly in the direction of Trump. And I want to be as clear as possible, right? There's 2016, 2020, and 2024, right? And so that can give you this snake-like pattern moving to the right in 2016, to the left in 2020, and to the right again in 2024. But please don't write with Latinos. Actually, they moved to the right in 2020 and then substantially further to the right in 2024. Because this is county level data, there's no gender data, right? No breaking down of men or women. They're basically 50-50 in all counties. They're not majority male and majority female counties, right? Native Americans moved to the right and substantially, right? 10 points, 13 points with Latinos, and even African American counties, majority African American counties, moved in the direction of Trump. We see this with counties which have an average younger population and counties with a middle age and less so counties with an older population, right? And these could be worrisome trends for the Democrats as we go forward in the next couple election cycles if young voters really are beginning to identify more as Republican. I will add, by the way, that this is now, I believe, up to 47. I believe Nevada has been called for, is this? Yeah, Nevada has been called for the Democrats, so this is accurate, 46 to 52, and we'll have to see what happens in Arizona. But the Republicans clearly have a majority in the Senate, despite the ticket splitting. That's the first time in 4 years they've gained the majority in the Senate. The House will probably take another 5 days or so to decide. But having said that, I think if all of the elections where Republicans are clearly currently in the lead go in the Republican column, then the Republicans will have clear control over both houses of Congress. You add to that that there's a conservative supermajority in the Supreme Court, that Donald Trump is likely to get at least 2, maybe 3 more appointments to the Supreme Court. One of the ways that people in the Federalist Society circles are putting this is that there will be a Trump Supreme Court until maybe 2045 or 2050, right? And I think it is clear that we are now in the era of complete MAGA control of the federal government. And that this is not just a partisan shift. We're used to pendulum swings, right? One party wins and then the electorate corrects. This is also a movement in the direction of what I want to call exclusionary populism, populism that says there's one right way to be an American. And if you are not with that movement, then you are an enemy of the people as opposed to a loyal opposition, a era of strongman politics. And this is in the oldest and most influential democracy in the world. Please note that this is a global movement, and I suspect that this was a movement that looked like maybe it was losing steam in 2024 as it did less well in some other elections. And now I think it has clearly regained steam as a result of Donald Trump's election in the United States. All right, so from a description of what happened to an effort to make sense of it, and I am prepared to speak for hours today. I do want you to have the opportunity to ask questions, make comments, express concerns, express disagreements as well. So anytime you want to, please put something in the chat, as David already has, or also just unmute yourself and ask a question. So, the first thing to note, right? This is a clear victory with voters moving in Trump's direction, and I want to describe it as, on the one hand, a realignment election. And I think it makes it clear that under Donald Trump's leadership, the Republican Party has become the party that better articulates the grievance, the anger, the mistrust of people who are not experiencing prosperity, not seeing economic mobility, as opposed to prosperity, feeling increased precariousness. And that is, as we've talked about repeatedly, a majority and a sizable majority of the American population. But I want to immediately add, this will be one of the central themes I'll be thinking about in this series of classes we'll have to do to make sense of this, that we are a cleaved nation. We are a bifurcated nation. We're not just a polarized nation, right? I think it's worthwhile noting that nearly 70 million people voted for the candidate who said that Donald Trump is a threat to American democracy. And so this is not sufficient to get Kamala Harris elected, but it is indicative of the degree to which, in this realignment, we have just pulled apart into two very equally divided, but really very opposed camps. And so the thought that maybe 2024 would put some of the divisiveness, some of the polarization behind us, the exact opposite seems to be the conclusion of this election. Second thing, it's clear that there is an anti-incumbent and anti-establishment mood on the part of the electorate. I want to suggest that that comes fundamentally from economics, but also from COVID, also from the failure of governments to enact policies that protect or limit the erosion of economic viability of the middle class in not only America, but many other developed democracies. And I want to suggest that the mood of the electorate is therefore one of anger and grievance, and not hope and incrementalism, right? We got a little bit better under Joe Biden. We need to continue on that path. Things will continue to get better step by step. No, things have actually gotten worse for most of us for long enough that incremental change, incremental progress is not going to do it. And I want to point out, right, that the limits of negative partisanship. This is a term that we've discussed before that's popular in contemporary political science. The idea that the main reason you vote for your candidate is because you fear what happens if the other side is elected. And that Kamala Harris, although she initially tried to resist that move, in the end found herself increasingly drawn to the idea that Donald Trump is disinhibited, that he is a threat to our society, to our democracy, that he has autocratic or fascistic attributes to his personality, and that he deeply divides us, that he's chaotic when in power. And so let us not go back to that time. And that this painted Harris into a corner, because if she is the anti-Trump candidate, then she cannot also be the candidate who is anti-incumbent, anti-establishment, gives vent to anger and grievance about the unfairness of the American economy. And so in particular, I want to suggest left negative partisanship may have been exposed as inadequate in this election, and that we may need to start thinking, as we think about what we need to do to regain credibility with those we lost in this election, about more left populism as an alternative that gives us more positive appeal than simply saying we're not the right populace. I want to just reiterate that I think this is the first post-truth, first fully post-truth election in American history. Not only that Kamala Harris gave up on fact-checking Donald Trump, but also that Donald Trump won despite being an obvious fabulist, right? Somebody who, when he's looking at a chart that says 7 million immigrants have come into the United States under Joe Biden's presidency, turns around and says 20 million came in, right? He just doesn't care. And that in the country of George Washington, who could not tell a lie, of Honest Abe, it used to be the case that honesty, truthfulness, at least the appearance of sincerity, were qualifying political attributes. That is clearly no longer the case. And part, but not all, of the explanation is what we've talked about in terms of epistemic anarchy. There is so much information flowing from so many different sources without any need for it to be verifiable or plausible before it circulates in the age of the digitally networked public sphere, with social media really having replaced mainstream or legacy media as the place where a large portion of Americans now get their news and information, and as a place that drives, right? The social media sphere drives the attention of large segments of the mainstream media. In that world of epistemic anarchy, it's hard to tell the difference between what is true and what is false, what is honest and what is dishonest. And when dishonesty is undiscernible, it becomes unaccountable. This is what not only Donald Trump, but a whole generation of rising right-wing populists appreciate, and it has untethered our politics from the virtue of honesty. Next big thing to take away from this. And here I'm going to talk about the psychology of those who voted against Trump and who are dismayed that he was elected. The deep sense of failure of accountability, justice, and democracy. And here, excuse me while I rattle off what I think are the clear attributes that in ordinary times would typically disqualify somebody from any kind of high office that apply to Donald Trump. He is a felon. He is a rapist, right? Civilly, not criminally convicted, but civilly accountable for having engaged in sexual assault. He is a coup plotter. He tried to resist the outcome of the previous election, not just on one day, but using all of the power of the presidency for months. He is a misogynist who regularly used sexist language to attack his female opponents and critics. He's a bully, it goes without saying, and he's a bullshitter in the technical, philosophical sense of somebody who is truth indifferent, and now he is president. And so the sense that, right, we live in a world where bad people get good things and where the worst among us become the most powerful among us, I think is dispiriting to many people. And we need to recognize that that is a trap, right? That being defeated by this outcome is the worst thing that we can do, as opposed to recognizing, well, we didn't fight well and hard enough. And yes, Donald Trump is the next president of the United States. Yes, he's likely to have control over the federal government. Yes, as Democrats, small d, not big D, people who play by the rules of electoral democracy, we do have to recognize that this institutional structure that we want to improve seems increasingly lacking in credibility to many of our fellow citizens. We need to abide by, at the same time that we try to improve its rules and norms. And that means we need to concede that Donald Trump won this election fairly, that he won this election in part because we did not do a good enough job in articulating our criticism of him, but most especially our alternative vision that gave people hope, faith, credibility in a policy path that did not involve right-wing populism. Having said all of that, while we therefore may criticize some of what Donald Trump does as potentially disastrous for the country in terms of ordinary policy, I think we also have to recognize that he has been given the mandate to do some of that. But what we cannot do is lose our compass and not recognize the difference between what a victor has a mandate to do in a democratic system and what is illegal, unconstitutional, or immoral to do. To target for vindictive treatment your political opponents, to suggest, as opposed to the loyal opposition, that they are the enemies of the people, to go after the most vulnerable in our population. I'll just note, right, that apparently the most popular Trump ad on social media was the one that said that Kamala is for they, them, Trump is for you, right? It was an ad that targeted essentially trans people for special persecution, right? And I think we need to be clear about the way in which many of our fellow Americans found that to be an appealing ad, and think through what that means for this moment where roughly half of us have become post-traditional, where religion and traditional gender and sexuality norms are much less authoritative for us, but the other half of the population finds that to be very threatening. We need to make sense of that and figure out how to respond appropriately to the widespread sense of normative threat. But we also need to stand up for, in the right way, those of our fellow citizens who are vulnerable and likely to come under attack in ways that are illegal, unconstitutional, immoral. We can't let the dispiriting nature of the fact that this man won this election keep us from also continuing to resist, continuing to fight, continuing in particular to stand up for our principles and for those among us who are going to be targeted by a second Trump administration. Having said all of that, I focused on Trump so far. I now want to try to make sense of the Trump supporters. And I want to do this because I think it's extraordinarily important that we don't think that voting for Trump was necessarily endorsing all of the worst things that he is going to do or that he stands for and represents. Yes, the majority of Americans did not consider those attributes, right? And I went through the list, right? That he's a felon, rapist, coup plotter, misogynist, bully, bullshitter. Didn't consider that to be disqualifying. And that should disturb us. But I think we need to own that part of the reason is because he did better at capturing the mood of the electorate, that in a sense, the discontent with what the economy has done to the majority of Americans for the last 40 years and the role that the state and the political and the intellectual or cultural elite have played in actually legitimizing and abetting the redistribution of income and wealth from the bottom of society and the middle of society to the top of society, that is a source of discontent, that you can understand why it would be articulated as a desire for vengeance, for a kind of punitive politics. Even if we have to resist that politics, we have to understand its sources. Let me try to get as clear as possible about the diversity of those sources. And so I've arrayed, I think, 7 different reasons people might have supported Trump. I want to be as clear as possible. This is a kind of political science exercise. People don't, right, go into the polling place with a list of 7 different reasons I could support Donald Trump and choose which one is the dominant one for them and then vote accordingly. But when we analyze what just happened, I think it is worthwhile to pull apart some of these differences and to think about which ones we need to respond to by acknowledging and doing better to address, and which ones we simply need to resist as bringing out the worst in our polity and the instincts that we need to keep down as opposed to figure out how to meet. So I've arranged them in a continuum, both from, I think, the least troubling, the most legitimate, and also in terms of how short or long term they are. So the first is the aftermath of COVID. And here I just want to be as clear as possible. This anti-incumbent, anti-establishment mood is imperiling what you might call the class of COVID-19 political elected leaders, right? Those people who were elected in the year or two in which COVID broke over the world have mainly also lost re-election. Modi in India is probably the most important exception, but he, please note, actually lost majority support and had to form a coalition to govern. And so the idea that both in terms of what this did to people's lives, what they lost through death, through disruption of important milestone events, especially for younger people, the degree to which this amplified the sense of isolation that was already present in our society, and then also economically, right? That COVID also amplified some of the economic stress, especially for people who really had very little in reserve. This is, it seems to me, one of the reasons, be it fair or unfair, that people voted against Joe Biden and his successor is because they were associated with the pandemic. And the pandemic, frankly, still hangs over a lot of people in this country with a sense of loss, both economic and personal. Second reason for voting for Donald Trump is inflation. And we've talked extensively about this. I'll immediately remind you that I don't believe it's just inflation, although we've looked together at food and fuel inflation and noted that they were up at 40%. And I'll say just a little bit more about this for a second vis-a-vis abortion, right? And so one of the things that we will have to figure out as we get better information is how many women voted for Donald Trump and from what educational or class or demographic backgrounds. But one of the things that's come out of the focus groups, both before the election and after the election, is the fact that many women had to be asked about abortion to indicate its significance. And as opposed to that, when simply asked, what is the most important issue for you? Many women said pocketbook issues, affordability, right? Inflation. And the fact that most women, or let me put it the other way around, most of the shopping in America is still done by women, right? Especially food shopping. And very often women are in charge of family finances, may have made the inflation of the last few years more salient than the abortion issue for women. We'll get into this today or in a subsequent class. Inflation clearly motivated a lot of people in their vote. Abortion did reasonably well, but didn't translate into support for Kamala Harris to the degree that people, including me, hoped that it might, right? And so I add inflation in the context of a pre-existing affordability crisis, and that this overshadowed, I think, the genuine and important macroeconomic resilience and success in the American economy over the last couple of years. I'm not showing it to you right now. I've been looking at this diagram of the American economy, its rate of growth, its rate of employment, its rate of unemployment, relative to the economies of all the other developed countries in the world. We are doing better in all of those categories. And yet inflation really hit people hard in ways that we've talked about because it made the affordability crisis, the incapacity of so many Americans to buy a home, to see how they can afford higher education for their children, to afford the child care expenses that are required of two-worker families, to be able to pay off their credit cards once interest rates go up, or their mortgages if they're in a home that they own and they've got a variable rate mortgage. This really did pinch Americans and really did pinch them in their role as consumers as much as workers, right? And that the Democrats, I think, unfortunately, were penalized for what was necessary to recover from the COVID recession. Third, the rapid rise in immigration. And here I think that this will be regarded as one of the central political failings of Joe Biden's presidency, alongside the failing to recognize that he needed to get out of the race much earlier than he did. And I call it a political failing because I need to be as clear as possible. I think that economically, we have benefited greatly from the heightened immigration under the Biden administration. We have a shrinking population, and we have an economy that is creating millions, 7 million new jobs over the last 5 years. If you don't have new people coming into your country, that combination produces inflation, wage growth, and the kind of inflation that becomes self-feeding if you're not careful, right? And so we have truly benefited from immigration economically, but the sense that, and here again, I want to put it in the deeper context, that there is rapid and threatening cultural and demographic change occurring in our society, and that as opposed to slowing it down, Joe Biden threw open the gates to immigration, right? To the kind of thing that leads to more of this change. And that as a result, he is not addressing what many people see as one of the fundamental problems in our country. The reason that we have, right, a affordability crisis. The reason that we have rising inequality and precariousness, and the reason that our government isn't doing anything about it is because we're no longer sufficiently cohesive as a society. Because the kind of solidarity that says we're all in this together and we're going to protect those among us who are dealing with hardship, that for many people seems to just no longer be the case. And they have an explanation that Donald Trump is offering them. That explanation is that we've become too diverse. We've become too multicultural. We've become too post-traditional. We're not Christian enough anymore. And please note, right, that the Democrats nominated to run against Donald Trump a biracial woman of color who's the child of two immigrants. And I'll just say a little bit more about this for a moment, because the issue here, right, of Joe Biden being blamed for inflation, Joe Biden being blamed for immigration, when arguably this is part of some of the most important economic success of his administration. The failure of the Biden administration, the failure of Kamala Harris as his successor, to be able to tell a cohesive, persuasive story, to offer a narrative that says, look, the last 4 years were hard, but we're through the hardest part of it. And not only that, we emerged from it hurt, but stronger. And that if we continue the path we're on, we will see the gains of the last 4 years turn into forms of progress that will begin to address some of the problems of the last 40 years. It's not an easy story to tell. I've talked with you about some of the narrative difficulties of saying it could have been worse, it's going to get better, and by the way, if you elect the other guy, he's going to undo the progress that we've made. That's a subtle story to tell. But the fact that neither Joe Biden nor Kamala Harris really appeared to be able to find the vocabulary in which to articulate this led the Democrats to cede this terrain, this essential terrain, to Donald Trump and to the MAGA Republicans. Fourth possible reason that I think accounts for why Donald Trump won, why people voted for him, all of his less attractive attributes notwithstanding, has to do with the long-term rise of inequality and precariousness and the loss of faith in the responsiveness of American institutions across the board, right? Not just our political institutions, our economic institutions, our cultural institutions, our mainstream media, our economic experts and elites, right? And the fact that none of them were able to articulate a policy, not just in the last 4 years, but in the last 40 years, the period of the rise of inequality, the growth of precariousness that meets the needs of the majority of Americans, of the middle class, but of the most vulnerable among us or the least well off in our society, has caused Americans to lose faith in the current elite, in their representatives, and to some degree in democracy. And so I do think, right, that many Americans heard Kamala Harris saying, Donald Trump is a threat to democracy. And they thought two things when they went in and voted for Donald Trump. The first is the way in which the yellow vest protester in France gave an answer to journalists, slightly modified, right? The protester who was protesting an increased gas tax said, I believe that climate change is real and that it's going to be a terrible threat to our planet 100 years from now. But I don't know how I'm going to pay my bills next month, right? And so when push comes to shove, I have to prioritize making ends meet now. And similarly, right, I think for many Americans, well, Donald Trump may be a threat to democracy, but I was better off when he was president. And frankly, when I think about those two things in the scale, I've got to keep a roof over the head of my children, right? And that's something that I need to do next month and the month after that. I don't think Donald Trump is going to dismantle our democracy next week. I'm going to vote for him, right? And more worrying, so I'll get to this in a moment, but what exactly has democracy done for me? The reason that I'm worried that I can't keep a head over my children's I'm sorry, I can't keep a roof over my children's heads, is because democracy has failed to address my growing precariousness for the last 20, 30, 40 years. So yes, I'm going to vote for that guy because I think he's going to help me make ends meet when the other party doesn't seem to have a persuasive agenda to convince me that they will. This gets then to the fifth strand in this complicated stew or cocktail of reasons to support Donald Trump, a punitive verdict on the American elite at all levels, right? The fact that they are saying that he's a scoundrel, that he's offensive, that he's divisive, that he's a threat to the institutions they care about is actually a reason to support him. He makes the people who have failed to look after our interests, who are so insular, so ineffective, so disconnected from us that they have gotten rich while we have seen our security erode. So, yes, we actually want to punish them. We want them to feel some of our pain. And Donald Trump is the perfect instrument to make the liberal elite suffer. And so, right, a much more negative, vindictive mood, reason to support Donald Trump. I'm not denying that that's there, but I do think it's not the only or the dominant reason to support Donald Trump. Sixth reason, or sixth, right, strain of possible sources of support, the desire to restore the impunity and swagger of the representative of a beleaguered identity, right? And here, please note that Donald Trump performs white male masculinity and privilege in an absolutely unrestrained way. It's like he got in a time machine and just refuses to recognize the way in which over the last 40, 50 years we have become a more diverse society, and we've called into question some of the misogyny, some of the racism of our culture. And for people, and I come back to that diagram I showed you, I think 2 weeks ago, that indicates that, right, the white worker without a college degree 40 years ago earned about 10% above the average income in our society. Today, they earn 10% or more less than the average income. And in that intervening 40 years, the white working class has been passed by women. Women with college degrees who are white, but also who are Black, Latino, Asian. And there's a sense of, I think, um, besieged identity that Donald Trump's ability to skate free from all of the controversy, from all of the criminality, indicates maybe people like him are not as problematic, not as disadvantaged as they appear to be, right? Seventh and final reason to support Donald Trump is disenchantment with American democracy. And I want to be as clear as possible. There are good reasons to be disenchanted with American democracy. We who want to repair it need to be honest about its limits and its faults. It is not responsive. It is not accountable. It is way too often polarized, paralyzed, and captured by the elites. One of the things I'm not going to get to talk with you very much about today, but I do think one of the deep worries about this election is the rise of plutocracy in the United States. And it's been going on for 40 years. It's been going on especially in the era in which the Supreme Court dismantled campaign finance control. And so we don't just in 2024 have big contributors standing behind the scenes, but telling Kamala Harris what she can and can't say, and enabling Donald Trump to spend billions, right? $15 billion spent in this election cycle. I'm sure it will be more when all is counted. But we also have Elon Musk right front and center of the campaign. And this idea that, frankly, Joe Biden, for having appointed Lena Khan as the chair of the Federal Trade Commission, for having appointed people who are anti-monopolist to the Justice Department, who just got a big verdict against Google, the revenge of the plutocrats against Joe Biden and the anti-monopoly strain in his administration, I think is really important, and that we should expect the next administration to be much more beholden to the hyper wealthy in our society. But it's a long-term trend and one that has eroded faith in our democracy. And so I do think at least a substantial portion, maybe substantial is too strong, but some portion of the people who voted for Donald Trump voted for him because they want to be, in the words of one of the books on populism, on a road to somewhere. And democracy, and the Democrats in particular in the 21st century, seem to be a road to nowhere. We've tried them, it doesn't work. Maybe a strong man is what we need. So the reason I unpack, right, the 7 different reasons people supported, or that seem to me to account for the coalition that Donald Trump was able to assemble in this election, is to make clear that at least half of those reasons are reasons, if not, right, that we should find fully convincing or persuasive, that we should acknowledge have some truth, some merit, some power behind them, and that we who want to chart a different direction for this country than strongman populism that is ultimately going to make this situation worse, not better, we need to figure out how to better reach those voters how to better articulate their interests, their grievances, their emotions, and then we need to figure out how to credibly present policies that will address their needs, but not just that, to get those policies passed in the 21st century. And there we have to own our failure to have done this and our loss of credibility as a result. There's a really important agenda for us to figure out. I'll say just one more thing. It's really reiterating a point I've made to you before. And that is that as a student of American history, as many students of American history will tell you, the United States is not a country. Most countries don't uh, follow the model of just incremental, regular progress. We just keep getting a little bit better, a little bit better, a little bit better. As opposed to that, right, we tend to make progress primarily in periods in which crisis gives rise to struggle, right? Political organizing, political struggle that emerges out of that is motivated by a sense that things have gotten really bad. That there's a depression, there's a war, there's a major threat from abroad, there's deep division within our society of a kind that we can no longer ignore or peacefully resolve, and that it may be that not just analyzing what we did wrong in 2024, but watching a would-be autocrat, watching a populist, watching a bully, watching someone, frankly, who doesn't have good policy ideas to address the problems, but is going to give us scapegoats and bread and circus distraction. Watching that unfold is going to generate the sense of crisis that we need to begin to figure out how to repair American democracy, restore the prospects for prosperity for the majority of Americans in the 21st century. All right, I'll stop. Who wants to start us out on a question, a thought, an idea for today? So I can see David and Flossie. You guys each drew at the same time. Who wants to go first? David, pass.
Always Flossie. I always defer to Flossie.
You got to unmute, Flossie. Flossie, you're still muted. Put.
I'll go over and unmute her. I'll be right back.
Oh, you're close by. Okay.
Yeah.
She usually figures out. Flossie, can you hold the space bar down?
Can you hear me now?
Yes, perfect. Thank you.
I
You're going to
think
have a
we,
vote from David Pearson. I'm sorry, a visit from David Pearson in a moment, I bet. But
now
go
I'm being facetious and I'm being naughty now. But sometimes watching Trump and his activities and his audacities and his nastiness reminds me of The Sopranos. Do you remember that series? It's
Tony,
like being a
Tony Soprano.
soprano.
Yeah.
If they're that kind of bunch. And it isn't only the wealth and the way the wealth is achieved, but it's the sex scenes are a little bit shocking. And I'm not easily shocked, but sometimes when I review The Sopranos, I can't believe what I'm looking at.
So thank you for
So
that.
I think we have to restore The Sopranos and have some commentary on what they represent so we can see what's happening with Trump and his gang of things and perverts and sexually active people right out in front.
So it's funny when I had on the board the idea that one of the appeals of Donald Trump is he restores the right? Impunity and swagger of a representative of a beleaguered identity, right? And I was thinking in a sense of Mick Jagger, but maybe David Chase, right, the creator of The Sopranos, is who we should have. I think part of the reason, right, that so many people go and scream and cheer at a Mick Jagger concert, a Rolling Stones concert, is because he's kind of the embodiment of disinhibited libido that we'd all love. Maybe I should be careful not to speak for everybody else, but that so many people would love to just for a little while be Mick Jagger. The second best thing you can do is go watch Mick Jagger, right? And this sense that yes, that Donald Trump represents the white man who can still get away with it all, right? Maybe the white man who, deep down, a lot of people fantasize about becoming, who, isn't just going to a dead end job worried about making their ends meet, but lives in, a variety of mansions and penthouses and owns a bunch of golf courses, right? So the idea that we do project onto our leaders. And sometimes we project our best aspirations, and sometimes we project our worst aspirations. I didn't get into this in the lecture because there's so much to talk about, but there's, I think, this concept of a permission structure, right?
Yeah.
What is it that we are given the latitude to do when a person like Donald Trump succeeds? And I do think the idea
We
that
can get away with murder.
you can kill someone on Fifth Avenue, you can certainly get away with trying to overthrow the election. You can get away with sexual aggression, right? And there's a interesting book, Christina Beltran at NYU, Cruelty as Citizenship, where she argues, look, citizenship in the United States for most of our history was the exclusive province of white men, right? And it came along with a tremendous license to get away with a lot of stuff, especially the predation, the theft, the expropriation of the lands of indigenous Americans, the enslavement of African Americans, marital rape, which was not a crime, as was sexual harassment, right? Seen as flirting, and the sense that equality, greater morality, less inequality have come as a loss to some people, a tremendous gain in the morality, the ethics, the equality, the decency of our society. And boy, I wish we had somebody who could explain adequately, publicly, the positive gains that more than compensate for the loss. But by the way, when that loss is accompanied by growing economic inequality and precariousness, by ineffective public responses, it really begins to feel like this is just one big downward spiral. And we want somebody who seems capable of being strong enough to reverse it. And that's a complicated stew of feelings and ideas that Donald Trump has maybe figured out how to meet, or maybe just got lucky being the right man at the right time for his brand. Let's see, I've got David, I've got Casa, I've got Wilma all raising their hands. Let's go in that order if that's okay.
Sure.
David,
Can you hear me?
that's fine, yes.
Three quick thoughts. In the 60s, I went to grad school at Minnesota and joined the Democratic Farmer Labor Party.
Yes.
We are now, we have lost both the farmers and the laborers. And that to me is an expression of the symptoms of why we've lost control of the national electorate, is that those two groups are more likely to vote for Trump than for liberal Democrats. Number two is, I go back to this notion of a grand narrative to counter Trump's. The MAGA narrative, like it or not, is a narrative that has found a sympathetic chord amongst the American people. And Donald Trump is no longer an anomaly. He is who we are in a sense. And so I don't know why we can't convince people that the real enemy is our politicians who want to move all the money to the top 10% of the income and wealth distribution in this country. And I saw a glimmer of it yesterday in Heather Clark Richardson's blog yesterday, in which apparently Trump people are just beginning to find out what tariffs will mean to them. And she gave an example of some piece of technology will cost over $1,000. It seems to me that Kamala's problem is she emphasized exhortations rather than explanations, and she didn't give any people any concrete reason to reject the Trump narrative about China's going to pay for all this and the like. And so I think we need a grand narrative that has lots of examples that people find both transparent and compelling. And I think that those two adjectives are things that Kamala, for whatever reasons, and I loved so much of what she had to say, failed to enact. So, and I'm working on a country and western satire song. I want to grow up to be Trump so I can pat women on the rump. So.
I hope that you've got more than that, David, but it's a good start. So let me, and if it were only the rump, let me comment on two things, right? Lost the workers and the farmers, and yes and no, and so clearly the Democratic Party has become the party that has the loyal support of the most educated and affluent in our society, and also, by the way, of some of the least well off in our society, the people who live in urban areas, people of color. I wonder, maybe I should share that map again really quickly of the actual, right, just the areas in the country that voted for Harris, right? And so this is I'm sorry, that's the Senate map. This is the map, right? And as you can see, although Harris won 48% of the vote, boy, is it geographically concentrated, right? And vast swaths of the country have become Republican. But let us also be careful, right? Harris, I think it's clear, right? You know, she didn't come through a primary. If she had come through a primary, either let us hope she would have acquired the political skills to more effectively offer that narrative, right? She had 100 days essentially to go from zero to victory, and she didn't get there. But had she gone through the primary, maybe she would have, or maybe we would have chosen somebody else who was better, right? So we handicapped ourselves. But having said that, let us also note, right, that in this century, this is only the second time a Republican has won the majority of the vote. So let's be careful in thinking that we've completely lost the support of the American people or the majority of the American people. It's just not true. Third thing, oh, can I remember it? There was one other thing that you said, the narrative. I'm sorry, and so coming back to that, the idea, and so you probably know Lakoff, who was I guess a colleague of yours, who said, look, the Democrats just need to get better at telling the story. They need to get better at connecting with the emotions. They need to get better at making things simple. And I think there's a very good response to that. Joseph Heath and others have made this, which is actually it's not that easy because the story the Democrats want to tell is a much more complicated story, right? And so if your story is the problem is all unfair competition from China and immigrants from South America, you've given people two enemies, two scapegoats, and it's pretty easy. Keep the goods from China out, keep the immigrants from the South out, and you fixed America's problems, right? And by the way, personifying it, it's them and them, works really well to grab the attention of the average mind. It's the way we tend to think. But having said that, it also has the disadvantage that it's untrue, right? And the story we need to get our heads around is a more complicated story, that this is globalization, automation, information technology, AI. And by the way, we make a lot of money from that. We just don't distribute it very fairly, right? And so the real problem is the capture of American institutions that both parties are part of, and that we need to, right, get better at redistributing income and wealth. That's a more complicated story. I come back to this idea, yes, Harris and Biden didn't have the narrative, but the narrative that they needed to create is a more complicated narrative. There's a structural advantage that people who are willing to say it's all their fault have. And most of the time it's not all anybody's fault, right? And so it's a problem. I think it's part of the reason that Harris fell back in the end on negative partisanship, on just saying you should be scared of what Donald Trump will do if you give him 4 more years.
Real quick response.
Yeah.
The more complicated the phenomenon, the simpler the message has to be about how it works. So
Yeah, which is the narrative talent that a Barack Obama had, right? That I guess I'm hoping that the next leader of the Democratic Party will have that same capacity, and that we'll actually find that person and put them at the lead of the party, as opposed to the person who best suits the interests of the donor class. Casa, do I have your name correct?
Yes, you do. But the problem is that this is a little bit out of sequence, as I was just going to actually quote something that Flossie had said earlier about Trump and equating him with Tony Soprano. And that at one point in time, she made the comment, and it was true, that Macbeth, we were talking about Macbeth, and she said, well, Macbeth to her represents ego, whereas Tony Soprano is pure id.
Yeah. Yeah, that was the reason I went to Mick Jagger, right? Id personified. And Tony Soprano, for whatever reason, needed a psychiatrist. He had some maybe greater depth to him. But having said that, yes, I do think a large part of the appeal of Donald Trump, and I'm going to use slightly more rarefied psychological language, is his disinhibition, right? And so there's this term in the literature, conversational constraint, right? We don't, let's use the vocabulary that Donald Trump used on the day before the election. We don't call women bitches in the 21st century, right? That was pretty common in large sectors of the American population in the middle of the 20th century, but it's become something that is recognized as part of a sexist or misogynist culture. Well, Donald Trump does, and he encourages his followers to do the same thing. He does a call and response, right? And the idea that we can just bully the vulnerable among us, as opposed to having to respect them despite their differences and vulnerabilities, is unfortunately, I think, part of the appeal. I hope for a minority of Donald Trump supporters, and I hope for people who are still capable of experiencing shame and who at some point will actually come to their senses and recognize, you know, this is not my better self. This is my worst self, and I don't need to give vent to it in the way in which I vote and who I give power to. Thank you, Casa. That was a good follow up on something that we left behind 10 minutes ago. But our memories are long enough still. Wilma, how about you take us to the last comment or question for today?
I really appreciate that you're all looking to solve the big issues behind this debacle. But my concern right now is how can we protect the people who are undocumented, who he's going to start deporting on day one? Because that's easy, those are them, that's not us. So why should we give a damn? But I care very deeply, and I want to know, how can we protect our neighbors right now? How can we offer sanctuary, effective sanctuary, to the people who are going to be his number one target?
And the idea of sanctuary, right? And obviously you're in a sanctuary city and in a sanctuary state, right? And so the idea that local law enforcement not cooperate with mass deportation is going to make mass deportation very difficult, right? And by the way, the idea that the ICE, right, the Immigration Customs Enforcement Agency, has nothing like the personnel required to deport the number of people that Trump has indicated, that Vance has indicated, that MAGA have indicated that they want to deport. I think there will be some practical impediments and some slowness to this. I go back to something that David said a few minutes ago, and I read the same letter from America from Heather Cox Richardson, in which she said, look, some people who voted for Donald Trump and are waking up to the idea that their gaming consoles may cost 40 or 50% more if these tariffs are in place are saying, wait a sec, I didn't vote for that. Right, and when we start thinking about, so there are vulnerable people in our midst. There are neighbors. There, some of them married to our neighbors who are citizens. But then let's add, by the way, that they're integral to the production of the food we eat. They provide all kinds of essential services in our society, in healthcare, in the food industry, in building, right? And we could keep going, right? I don't think the college I teach at would be cleaned or staffed if these deportation policies were enacted, right? And so maybe there's also the hope that in the amount of time that it might take to actually work out these policies, to beef up the ICE staff, to figure out if the military can be involved in this, some people will start to get through and say, be careful what you wish for, because doing this is not just cruel. It's not just inhumane. It's also self-destructive. Please note, right, that Donald Trump has named his chief of staff at Susie Wiles, who was his co-manager of his campaign, and she is going to be, I believe, laser focused on his popularity, on what his policy is going to do for the electoral prospects of Republicans, and especially MAGA Republicans in the future. Please note that she is from Florida, that she is integral, incredibly important to the movement of Florida from being a swing state to just being a solidly red state. That part of the way she did that is she got Republicans to actually pay attention to the interests of Latinos, which is the single largest growing demographic in the United States. And she is not going to want to see Donald Trump pursuing policies that are highly inflationary or that alienate the constituency that just elected him. right? And so maybe there will be some checks on him. I don't know, internal checks. If not, then yes, Wilma. And this is actually one of the big topics I want to discuss in the coming lectures is not just how do we resist, but how do we effectively resist. I think part of the issue here is differentiating what is legitimate, what he has a mandate to do, what is legal, and being part of the loyal opposition, saying loudly and clearly, you do those tariffs, you're going to cause a lot of inflation, but you have the authority. Do them if you must, and we will remind you 2 years from now that we told you that it was going to cause all this inflation. But if you start going after your political opponents, if you start using the Justice Department, law enforcement, intelligence gathering agencies to go after your political opponents within the Republican Party or within the Democratic Party or within the press. If you start doing family separation again, then yes, we don't just criticize, we protest, and we try to figure out how to protest in a way that effectively alerts our fellow citizens to the fact that we don't just consider this bad policy, we consider this fundamentally unjust, unconstitutional, illegal, and that is the reason that we're not just saying that this is a mistake, but we're trying to give sanctuary, we're trying to impede law enforcement when it is doing things that are un-American, right? And so yes, well, we've got to go there. We've got to have that conversation as well. But that's for a day in which we've spoken for less than an hour and a half already, right? So thank you for raising that, Wilma, and I do promise we will come back to that in future classes, okay? Good being with everybody. I know this is not what we hoped for. I know this is not what we wanted. I leave you again with that thought that sometimes progress requires crisis. And if there's one thing I think we can be pretty confident that Donald Trump will deliver, it is a sense of crisis. It may be that this is what we have to suffer through in order to break the impasse that has been characteristic of American politics and society for so much of the last 40 years. Hang in there, be calm, we will carry on, we will figure out what we need to do and how to make sense of this together over the weeks to come. Bye, everybody. Be well. Thank you.